Welcome to The Third Story. I'm Leo Sidran. Today's conversation is with Michael Leonhart. Michael grew up in New York City in a musical house. He's the son of jazz bassist Jay Leonhart and jazz singer Donna Leonhart. His older sister, Carolyn Leonhart, is also a singer. He became very accomplished at a young age. At 17, he received both the first Grammy Award for Outstanding High School Musician, and he became a Presidential Scholar of the Arts. Shortly after that, he toured as part of the Philip Morris Super Band with some of the most exciting jazz musicians of the day, and still to this day. And it seemed like he was on his way to having a somewhat traditional career as a jazz trumpet player, if there is such a thing as a somewhat traditional career as a jazz trumpet player. He talks in the conversation about some of the reasons why he hasn't followed that path exactly. I think what's pretty clear about him, probably from the first moment you hear him talk, is just how curious and inquisitive he is about everything. He says at one point, "I've tried to set up my life like a college class." And that shows in the kinds of choices he makes creatively. One of his most notable collaborations has been with Steely Dan. I first became aware of him when I saw his name on their Two Against Nature album in 2000, and he's played with them for nearly 18 years now. He also co-produced Donald Fagen's solo album, Sunken Condos, which was released in 2012, and he played many of the instruments on that record. He even played drums on it. A pretty bold move, considering so many great drummers have played with Fagen over the years. When I asked him about what it's like to operate under all that pressure, he said, "I've learned to get lost in the work every day. 6 to 8 hours of work, and then you're too tired to worry." I like that. He's also recorded 6 albums as a solo artist and 1 EP. The first 3 were more instrumental jazz albums, released on the French label Sunnyside. And then in 2006, he released an album with a kind of vintage psychedelic sound called The Ballad of Minton Quigley, which was heavily influenced by Serge Gainsbourg. He's married to the fantastic singer-songwriter Jamie Leonhart, with whom he also works regularly. And before we get to the conversation, I want to play an excerpt from his most recent solo album, 2011's Seahorse and the Storyteller. This is the title track. So, man, I haven't seen you in 2 years.
Is that for real?
I mean, I think it's at least 2 years.
But where was the last time? At the
other studio.
And you hadn't... She was pregnant. How old is she now?
2.5.
Where is she?
She's at school.
Like how long? How long are the days?
3 mornings a week. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, just from 9 to noon.
That's how it starts. And then As my sister said, they go to the show.
Oh,
They go to the show. The big leagues.
But yours isn't in the show yet.
He's in the show.
He's in the show.
He's in the show. 5 days a week, 9 to 2:15. It's fucking amazing. It's all of a sudden, it's like, what? In theory, I could come back and throw my wife on the bed at 9:30. Mm-hmm. Now that...
It's funny that occurred to you. I can't...
It is amazing. We went, holy shit, we don't know what he's doing at school. None of the kids will tell you, which is another story, which now I have the keys as to how to get some information. But you ask them, what did you do at school? They go, I don't know. You don't know? I'll tell you later. I'm like, argh!
And so it begins.
And so it begins.
This is probably a good opportunity to ask you about what it was like for you growing up in the city, because you also grew up in Manhattan.
Well, where to start? I mean, what part of it?
You grew up in a musical house?
Yeah, very much. My father's Jay, singer, songwriter, bass player, record producer, nice guitar player, nice rhythm guitar player, actually. And my mother, who was a wonderful singer, stopped singing when she was about 25 professionally, raised the kids, and then started singing again, but has been on and off with her singing. But there was always music around. And my sister also, even though I was more into painting until I was about 10, and my sister was always singing. My sister Carolyn and I did sing on commercials, believe it or not. When she's 3 years older, I was about 5, she was 8. We did like, la 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 la. I guess we could hold a pitch. I have no recollection of just someone saying, would you sing? And we did it. And we were the voice of something like Pierre the Lion. And then I stopped, and then I realized what I was doing, and I went a little more inside and was painting. I was a nervous kid. I was a very nervous kid, which now, being a dad, I have insights as to why I may have been nervous.
What do you mean?
Well, I think when you grow up in a very creative household, and your parents are creative, sometimes they're not accessible. And so you're left to try and calm yourself down. I was given the tools to be extremely creative, but I was not really given the tools to calm myself down, which I think in turn, once I started, like a light switch going on, when I started playing music at about 10, once I started doing it. And I played a little violin. I'm told I had a good sound, but I didn't want to stand up, which of course is total bullshit, because I play trumpet where you always stand. I said, I think I'll stop. And then I played drums, or snare drum and kit. And my sense of coordination was good, but I didn't want to just play the snare. So I stopped that. And then I started playing trumpet, and everything kind of clicked. And once that happened, I really found this very peaceful place. I didn't know it at the time, but looking back, I found a place where everything was very calm. It's probably not a mistake that I chose an instrument where you were required to take a breath in and then breathe out. And in the process of doing that, you do calm your body down. Mm-hmm. So that was it. That's once I started doing that, I became calmer. I found like an oasis, which now, being a parent, my wife and I have tried to teach. We started teaching our child that at 1. So he now says, how do I calm my body down? How do I calm my body down? We said, just breathe with us. So it's interesting how you either break the cycle, but it was extremely creative in my house, with tons of ideas flying around, lots of music. I remember waking up. In fact, most mornings I remember waking up and hearing from the other side of the wall my dad practicing upright bass. Boom, 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 bing, boom, bing, boom, bing, boom, 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 and these crazy little intervals. Is
that specifically what he would play?
Yeah, very specific. Yeah, boom, bing, 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 boom. He would do sixths and tenths and strange, and then he'd come and go, yeah, man. I mean, at that time I wasn't speaking the language with him, but I have a really strong recollection of having a Juno 60 in my bedroom, which he used to write the rhythm parts for an album of his called There's Gonna Be Trouble. And he would do almost like Freddie Green on a synthesizer, the third and the seventh. And I would say, how do you know so quickly what the third and the seventh is? And he said, just you do it slowly, and trust me, in a year you'll be surpassing me. Now, it's interesting. He said surpassing, but I think what he meant was this will be easy, because we would sit in the car. When my mother would go in, like we'd be driving somewhere with the family, and my mother and sister would go in to use the bathroom, and we'd be listening to whatever the jazz station was, and he would tell me the chords, and I would say, no way. There's no way that you can tell the chords. And he would say, you just do it, and you speak the language. And he wasn't showing off. He said, it's just like a language that you speak. And if you do it, you'll speak it. I mean, I remember actually hearing some Steely Dan, or there was something about there was maybe a Larry Carlton album, and like it was something in C, and I heard it stayed in C, and then I heard a B flat 13 sharp 11. Looking back, it was the way. I mean, I heard Quincy Jones describe a similar thing. It's like he described it as someone putting a C triad over a B flat chord, a B flat 7 chord. And it was a chord that I'd heard a lot in hard bop and even Gil Evans, but there was something that caught my ear about the way that on a Steely Dan or, in particular, Larry Carlton, that the guitar rang on that chord, and he knew what it was, and I thought it was the coolest thing that you could tell. So fast forward a year or two, and I had figured those things out, and then we started speaking the same language. He sort of showed me, you'd say, this is third and the seventh, and it did lead into me arranging, and there were things that I started getting into that he hadn't looked into. The way I kept on going with the Gil Evans scores and Ellington and even Ravel and Stravinsky, and looking at, well, okay, so if you have that a B flat 13 sharp 11 and you have the C triad over it, it's going to sound different if you have trumpet on E and a tenor on the C below it. It's going to sound different if you have an oboe on the G and you put a flugelhorn on the C below it, and then you put an alto saxophone. And, well, an alto really shouldn't be above the flugelhorn, but why not? And then looking, that one thing would lead to another. And Art Pepper and Jack Sheldon, and going, okay, well, wait a second. Well, if you have a tone like Art Pepper, then maybe you can. So...
And how old were you when this was starting to open up for you?
That was probably 12 or 13, or 14. It was ongoing. But I remember I was also dealing with what all kids deal with in their teenage years, which is having to, older kids pressuring you. And even though, I could hang with all the kids. I was cool enough, but inside I was also highly insecure. So I would sit at the piano for hours. And as a trumpet player, I had a lot of technique early. I could play, but about a year into it, I kind of peaked where I could immediately play a high C on trumpet, but then it didn't get any better. So I would practice 10 or 15 minutes and stop. And I would so I would practice trumpet for 15, and then I would sit at the piano with the intention of sitting down for 10 or 15, but because there was no limit technically or physically, I would turn around and I had been at the piano for 75 minutes. And then not playing, anything technical, but sitting and listening to the sound of the notes and the chords and voicing things, and maybe sitting at a score. And because there was no physical boundary to playing piano, time would just go by forever. With trumpet, once I got into the grueling technical aspect, after about 7 minutes, I would look and go, is this over yet? So that kept on going, and I kept on advancing on trumpet, but I struggled with developing great technique on trumpet, which as a trumpet player now at 39 years old, if I could teach the 12-year-old, I would say, you know what, let's look at slowly the technique and the equipment. I often think I wish I could have, I think we all do, gone back and told my younger self, don't sweat it so much. There are other elements. I was playing huge equipment, mostly coming out of Wynton Marsalis was playing a very large mouthpiece at the time. Chet Baker and those guys. And Miles played a medium-sized mouthpiece. But all these guys at the time, this would have been 1986. most guys were playing large equipment, so it seemed like the norm. But for me, to this day, if you put me on that equipment, I would be kind of handcuffed. I could play a little bit, but I would be struggling. So it took me a good 20 years to realize maybe there's something that will allow me that'll open a door. There were times that I remember sitting and crying with a teacher. I cried in a lesson. I was about 13. I said, this is so hard. And I think the ideas that were in my head just went way beyond what I could technically handle. And I was I was still above the norm, so it was kind of like as someone who there's talent there, but still you need a great teacher that will say, okay, you have natural gifts in this and that, but if you want to be a well-rounded trumpet player, if you want to achieve what you're hearing, let's work on this. And that takes, I had some wonderful teachers, but in some ways I had to find my own path. I mean, there was an incredible teacher later on, Chris Gecker, who was more of a classical and studio trumpet player, but one of the richest sounds, and he was extremely compassionate and focused. I took a lesson with Laurie Frink, who just passed away, who came out of the Carmine Caruso school and had this book, Flexus. There was there was one moment where my dad saw that I was struggling with technique and feeling like I had really hit a wall, that I just couldn't play, literally if two choruses on a 32-bar form, I'd be blown out by the bridge of the second chorus. And I was hearing on albums that Clifford Brown and Freddie Hubbard were able to do this and keep on sewing. Lee Morgan could go, Miles could go, Chet Baker, Cootie Williams. Everyone was able to play 2-minute solo. So why was I struggling with it so much? Why were my muscles giving out? And this is what I struggled with, and to this day even struggle with it. But now it's tenable. It's not like out of, I know the technique to do it. But I said, this is so difficult. He said, well, let me see if I can. He said, Alan Rubin is one of the all-around best trumpet players I know, and he lives nearby. So he came over, and Alan Rubin, who passed away, I think 2 or 3 years ago, from the Blues Brothers, and was not known as a jazz trumpet soloist, but he had this incredible buttery tone. And he came over and he sat and we played and we talked. And he said, you know what, you're going to be fine. Just keep on doing it. So it was a little vague, but it was a really nice vote of confidence and kept me going.
So that sounds like a good example of what kind of resources you had when you were struggling or in your development growing up in New York, and particularly in a musical family, that you had access to a lot of great musicians and a lot of people who could help guide you.
Oh, no doubt. I mean, there was some access. Some of it came through me and hard work and just meeting people. Other came from just being born into a musical scene. Others, the geography of being in New York. I mean, I remember going over to Wynton Marsalis' house. I think it was my senior year in high school. I think I had won some awards. And so Wynton had heard that I was this young hotshot trumpet player. And I went over to his place on 19th and 3rd. It wasn't really a lesson. It was kind of a cryptic hang where we had chicken, and I looked at his trumpets, and it was fun. It wasn't. We didn't really do much, but I think he contacted the teacher at Music and Art. So a lot of it was playing, putting yourself in the right situation, and then, for better or for worse, kind of proving yourself, standing out a little bit.
Man, you're the second person who's told me about an experience in high school with Wynton where you remember what you ate, but you don't remember it being much of a lesson.
Well, he does. There's something charming that he comes from. He comes from a place where the hang is equally as important as any technique, even though the image that comes across is that it's all intellectual technique. Food and sports are a major sort of conduit towards getting to what's going on. So I do remember that.
Your sister's older.
Yes.
Was she into music before you were?
Yes, she was bouncing a ball to Sir Duke when she was like 6. And my dad sat there with his jaw on the floor. She would, da, 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 And she would bounce the ball, and as the ball would come up, she would change tempos, and he just went, oh. So something in her DNA was just there.
And was there some attraction to music in particular for you because she was already musical, do you think?
Well, yeah, because I remember she listened to a lot of Jackson 5. She loved Michael Jackson. And then later on, she didn't like the Beatles at all. But she loved jazz, but she loved a lot of soul, R&B, Shaka Khan, Rufus. And I think any kid usually gravitates towards their older siblings' record collection. Or at least they definitely have a strong reaction to it. Either they hate it, but most often it was like she listened to stuff and I went, oh, that's kind of cool. I remember going to a piano lesson with her once. We were on 88th Street, so the piano lesson was like a Russian woman in her 80s. It was a couple blocks away, and I sat in the waiting room, and then my mom picked us up or something, or we were waiting, and the teacher said, would you like to come and try the piano? And I went in, and she said, and I sat, and I loved the sound that it made, but she told me to curl my fingers, and I was like, this sucks.
I had the same experience, man.
It's like, I'm done with this. I'll curl your fingers. So I was aware that my sister was taking piano, but I went, don't tell me what to do, dude. So there were little things like that. And then I saw her, she was singing. She was the only white girl in the gospel choir at Music and Art. And she had her hair crimped. And I thought that was very cool.
So she went to Music and Art High School before you did?
Yeah.
And were you aware of the high school already, or seeing her go, you realized, or you were interested in it, or?
I knew when I was 12, I heard that there was an all-city band which had some killer players in it. And I don't remember. As I said, I had, out of the gate, I was able to play a lot of, improvise well, and I had a good tone on trumpet and could play the high C. And so word got out that there was this young kid like who can solo. And I heard that there was an all-city band, so they let me be in it in 8th grade when I was 12 or 13 or something. And I was in the band, and I looked around, and I was like, why the hell is almost everyone in the band, the ones who are the best soloists at Music and Art or LaGuardia? Mm-hmm. I was like, this is like an all-star game where all the best players are on the Yankees. I want to be on the Yankees. So then I realized, and my sister goes there. Let me look into this. So the fact that I was in the all city band meant that as long as I played the way I could play at the audition, I got in, and I just loved the players that were in Music and Art. It was an amazing scene, especially my first 2 years. It was like Walter Blanding Jr., Abe Burton, Eric McPherson, Greg Hutchinson wasn't at the school, but he was in the all-city band. William Ash, Jeremy Manasseh, Jason Lindner, Danny Friedman. It was great. Great players.
That experience of being at Music and Art, was that important to your musical development?
Absolutely.
Was it a specific teacher, or was it the general?
Yeah, Justin DeChocho, who was sort of the guru and still is. We had a reunion. I believe he runs the jazz department at Manhattan School of Music.
I think so too.
He was an amazing figure. Just what he did to corral all these minds, and teaching jazz is a very weird thing. It's kind of like teaching someone to feel. It's, in my opinion, how do you teach someone to improvise? You can give them the tools and show them the path, and then you have to push them and let them go. Looking back, what he did was amazing, in terms of doing that, and also lighting the fire for people to keep on studying and learning and wanting to do it. So there were, I guess, 30 years of students at that reunion. There was another guy, actually, who I saw in Japan. Before I went to Fieldston for 2 years before I went to Music and Art, and there was a guy named Randy Wanless who I saw in Japan. He teaches there at an American school, doesn't speak a lick of Japanese. And before I got to Music and Art, I remember now, I heard in his office that he had a great jazz men up there. And his fascination was Cannonball Adderley, the quintet or sextet, Bobby Timmons. He had a real hard bop thing going on. And I thought that was the coolest music in the world. Dat Dare, Ping Pong from Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. It was a lot of Riverside Records, a lot of Blue Note. I thought that, looking back, I thought the tone on those albums was insane. At the time, I didn't know what it was.
You're talking about the actual sound of the record?
The sound of the instruments, the way I have chills thinking about it, the way the piano sounded, the way the drums sounded. And fast forward 25 years, in working on Donald Fagen's album, what we talked about, it's a year into the album, was, yeah, man, it's good. It sounds the way it should, like an old Blue Note album. And I went, are you kidding? That's exactly the sound, the blueprint for what I think things should sound like. And it's not, it's the mood, it's the naturalness of the instruments, the way they sit in the stereo field, or even, mono, the depth, the timbre, this sort of whiskey sounding, breath to all the instruments, the way the drums ring out. And that has influenced me forever, the sound of those albums. Yeah, there was Ellington as well, some Gil Evans, but there was something about when you hear even the Joe Henderson and Kenny Dorham albums, Una Mas or Inner Urge, Page One, the way that those instruments blend together, it was as important to me then as when I heard sort of the Rolling Stones, and you go, how the hell on Gimme Shelter, how did they get all the vocal and those sounds? It was that powerful to me. So Randy had a huge impact.
At Fieldston.
At Fieldston. It was only a year and a half because he left, but he had an amazing taste in music.
You're talking right now about this sort of development basically as a jazz soloist, really, as a trumpeter. I'm curious at what point you also became aware of all this other stuff that informs you today, because your most recent solo records don't necessarily represent you as a jazz trumpet player.
Right.
So at some point it seems like this other stuff got into the veins also.
It was very early on. I did know it, but I didn't think about it. I mean, a 12-year-old doesn't really think about this. It may have even been around 11. I think I started trumpet about 10 and a half. So as I was saying, my biggest problem was endurance. So I could really burn and burn bright for like a good minute and a half. So I had a real solid 75 to 90 seconds. So of course I wasn't going to I probably did some jam sessions where guys were playing guitar and bass and they're going for an hour or two and I'm sounding like shit. So I stopped going to those. Or I would only go for like a half hour, and I would practice in my room at home and try and work on the, beep, boop, all the things I was hearing. And after 20 minutes, I couldn't practice anymore. So then the Juno 60 that I spoke of earlier, my dad also had a sequencer. And I remember there was I think it's called a transpose button. It's like a little yellow or orange button on the Juno 60. So, and it's polyphonic, so you hit any chord, and it has this kind of Eddie Harris, a maestro box thing where you hit, and I thought, this is the coolest thing in the world. And I don't know if I had the glide, but it would go, and the sequencer would go, so I was gone for like hours once I discovered that, and then there was maybe a small reel-to-reel or something. So now I was getting into like a weird, Perry and Kingsley or like Raymond Scott world without knowing it, and just having things looped. So I now had this beautiful sonic Brian Eno kind of bed, and I could go and practice piano on top of that, or I could go to track 2 and record some other things, or get my 90 seconds of hot trumpet on track 3 stopped, and I was basically experimenting with sound and multi-track recording. So I kept on doing that, and that was sort of opening the door, definitely in my brain towards, well, there's going to be one part of me that plays this instrument, and there's going to be another part that sort of deals with the architecture of music. Mm-hmm. And again, I'm looking back on it now through the prism of a 39-year-old, but it makes perfect sense to me. In fact, I'm realizing this as I'm sitting here talking to you, but it makes really perfect sense what I chose to keep in the mix and what I chose to filter out.
Mm-hmm. Before we talk about that process of filtration, I know that in high school you won an award as a trumpeter.
Yeah.
And then you started to record. You sort of started a career that looked like maybe you were going to show up in a suit and be playing at the Blue Note and kind of have that trajectory. What was going on then? What was happening?
That was very interesting because it was 1992. I think I was 17, and I won the first Grammy for Best High School Musician. I guess it was for trumpet, but it was for Best High School Musician in the United States, and it was presented by none other than Henry Mancini, who at the time I was not an asshole with him, but I was like, yo, Peter Gunn, I'm into Joe Henderson. So I knew him as the Pink Panther and Peter Gunn, and he came and conducted this band and presented the award as well, and we talked a little bit, but he was a strong character. Well, we got along beautifully, but I was 17, and clearly I think, he had me solo. I think he liked the way I played over his music. And we talked a little bit, but I didn't have a lot of questions for him, and I was cordial. I was not a jerk, but I just said, hey, a pleasure to meet you. And then I saw him 6 months later at the Kennedy Center because it was a real crazy year for me, my senior year. I also got a Presidential Scholar Award in the arts, but it was for grades as well. So it was the national, I forget the exact words, but I was a Presidential Scholar, which is based on your grades, your academic grades, and your role in the arts. So we were presented that at the Kennedy Center, and who presented it to me but Henry Mancini. So now I saw him backstage, and I said, hey, great to see you again. He said, great to see you, buddy. And there's a picture, and I'm totally dorked out with glasses the size of, my kneecaps and my hair my wife loves that photo. And we spoke a little bit, but I was still I was getting to Gil Evans and sort of this thing. I was only at 1958, and in my world, he was the Pink Panther and Blake Edwards. And I hadn't gotten into his TV work of the 50s. I was only at the studio work of the 50s. And
you were just taking it chronologically.
Not even chronologically. I was going through the jazz and I was jumping from stone to stone as I chose. But I didn't get into TV and film scoring, which would have led me to him. Mm-hmm. And about a year after that, he passed away. And around that time is when I started to get into. I had a small crush on Audrey Hepburn. Mm-hmm. And was watching Charade, and I heard this music, and not the themes, these crazy sort of tribal drum things with fuzz tremolo guitars in 6/4, and I went, who wrote this? And I went, Henry Mancini. I went, oh no, oh boy, oh shit. And then there's some incidental music. There's a scene where she walks into her apartment, and her husband is missing, and all the furniture is gone. And as she walks in, there's a Fender Rhodes and a vibraphone that rings out, and it's not dissimilar to that B flat 13 sharp 11 chord with no note there's nothing in the bass. And when I heard it, this is VHS at the time, I kept on rewinding. I went, what the hell is that? And it's like Rhodes, tremolo Rhodes, vibraphone, and probably small string section tremoloing, and I went, oh, that's the same sound. And that led me back to Henry Mancini and discovering all of his great stuff, Latin Mancini, Uniquely Mancini, Combo, all these great albums that, while they're considered more film jazz, it still is the same language that I wanted to speak. So it was crazy. I mean, I went off on a tangent here, but I did have a regret that I kind of was quick to judge, oh, this guy's just, Mr. Pink Panther, Peter Gunn, when that was the tip of the iceberg, and I soon discovered that the scene in Arabesque with Sophie Loren, where he put, I think, one or two bass flutes through an analog tape delay, and I went, this guy was crazy.
Did that inform the way you approached meeting other people after that? I mean, it sounds like you remember not judging a book by its cover to a certain degree after that.
Yes, because, your question was about my role in...
Yeah, your early sort of jazz career, young lion jazz career.
Let me see if I can put the two together, because there is something interesting that happened where... So I won those awards, And I was still, in my mind, struggling with endurance on the trumpet and being able to play everything that I heard and have, thinking almost vertically, being able to play and even Daoud. And I couldn't, when I would play it, and I kept on thinking, why is this so fucking hard? So I was still struggling with that. Yet now there was this buzz from winning awards, and it was at a time when everyone was getting romanced by record labels, Blue Note, Verve, Atlantic. So all those labels started to court me in a way. And what it was is they didn't want to sign me just yet. They paid for a 3 or 4 song demo. Mm-hmm. And the farthest that I got was with Blue Note Records and Bruce Lonval and Ettore Strada, who, do you know Ettore? Yeah. He's an Italian record producer. He saw me and sensed that there was something strong, and he helped put together the deal where they paid $5,000-$10,000 for me to go to a big New York studio and do a demo. So we did it, and of course I was like, oh wow, I'm going to do some crazy writing. So I did a couple standards and 2 originals, and I was deeply into Speak Like a Child, mm-hmm. Herbie Hancock's album. So I got rhythm section. I think Bill Charlotte was on piano, Dennis McCrell on drums, my dad on bass. And I got 2 alto flutes, bass clarinet, French horn, myself, and something else. And the writing was really, really cool. And my playing for a 4-hour session was great for the first hour, and then it kind of had a sense of, it wasn't bad, but it wasn't at a certain level. It sounded like there was a little bit of a struggle. I know there were no cracked notes, but it was safe. It was as if I was wearing a straitjacket. And sure enough, I couldn't comfortably play above an E or an F on the trumpet, and the recording reflects that. And they heard and they said, "Wow, there's some amazing writing here." I mean, the sense, with all humility, the sense of timbral development, it was strong. I have the tape somewhere, and it's really well done. The trumpet playing is the thing that sounds. If I heard blindfold test, I would say this is probably a young guy. So the Blue Note said he's not ready. And I felt a little rejected, but I also kind of felt relieved, mm-hmm. because I didn't feel like I could do all the stuff on trumpet. So there was a similar thing. I did the Philip Morris Superband tour with Christian McBride and Ryan Kaiser, Jesse Davis, Josh Redman, Mike Ledon, and Lewis Nash. And that was a tough experience for me because I felt invisible. There's a real click. There was an even McBride and Ryan were very young, but they were so physically adept at their instruments that it was undeniable. McBride was already on like 20 albums.
And how old were you?
I was 18.
So it was like right after high school.
Yeah. And I was driving back after the tour was done, and I heard a song on the radio on BGO, and it was beep, 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 on the changes to some standard, and I went, I know this song. And then I went, oh, and I nearly crashed the car. I pulled over and I went, that's the song that we've been playing for the last 6 weeks. And now they recorded it, and they went and they did an album without me. And in fact, it was Peter Washington instead of McBride on bass. But I was crushed. They didn't, and I thought this is how they wanted it all along. It was Ryan on trumpet, and everyone sounded great, but I was a little crushed. And I thought, okay, so this is how the world works. This is a powerful lesson. So I didn't really fit in to that Young Lions jazz scene. Looking back, I wouldn't change anything, but it was tough. Again, I didn't suck. Just I didn't have that fortitude, that massive kind of endurance to be able to, hang in jam sessions and play long sets. I mean, I would hear Roy Hargrove play, and this guy was the master and is the master of jam sessions. He can arc a solo, and he's like he has more endurance in his third chorus than he does in his first chorus, mm-hmm. and that was always my weakness and his strength. So the combination of all these things the fact that I loved writing in timbral, tone, but not incredible endurance across blowing, it did lead to me writing for my own group, which was an album I put out called Aardvark Poses when I was about 20. And Sunnyside Records, Francois Alekane, who owns it, had long said, I would love to put out something by you when you're ready. And I love that he was patient. So I went in and used some of my tour money to record a quartet with Ari Ambrose on tenor, Joe Martin on bass, and John Wilson on drums. And it was almost like an Ornette thing. I had a little bit of Chet Baker and Jerry Mulligan. I had a little bit of Art Farmer and Jerry Mulligan. I love that no chords in it. And it came out on Sunnyside, and it was a good album. My son still listens to it. And that's what led to Donald Fagen and Walter Becker hearing that and asking me to... They had heard about me, but that was essentially the audition.
Hearing that record.
Yeah.
Was your sister hooked up with them at that point?
We got in at the same time. It was 1996. In 95, I was in Washington again. I mean, we're finding the thread to all this. In 95, I was with Chris Potter in Washington, D.C. Maybe it was 94 or something. And we were back playing at the Kennedy Center because he, too, was a scholar of the arts. And they asked us to come down and be alumni or something, or play a show. And Chris and I knew each other a little bit. So we had a quintet and we played. And I was starting to get my technique together more so that I had greater endurance. And again, it was sort of this thing where it wasn't always evident, but it was something that I was struggling with always. How do I play a full set on trumpet? So I was playing with Chris, and I think maybe the first or second night, he comes downstairs at the hotel and he said, I just got a call. This is before cell phones. So he said, my girlfriend said there was a call at home in Brooklyn from Steely Dan, that they're they want a tour. I said, oh, that's cool. I always liked Steely Dan. So a year later, word was out that Steely Dan was going back on the road, and they wanted to switch it up, and they wanted a trumpet player. They were looking for a new horn section, and they were looking for new background singers, because they always, were revolving door bands. Mm-hmm. So the studio manager, Scott Barkham at River Sound, which was Donald's recording studio in the upper 90s in Manhattan, who had Donald's ear, said, listen, I've heard about this brother and sister. Check him out. And that opened the door, and it was a 4 or 5 month wait period of sending stuff in, talking with them, and hearing nothing, which when you're 21 is a long time. Mm-hmm. And finally word came back, yeah, you're in. We start in 5 months, and it's a 6-month tour. And I went, oh. And that was 1996.
So you started touring with them before you recorded?
Recording with them?
Recording with them.
Yeah, that's right. The first Steely Dan tour was 96, and then we started Two Against Nature in 98. At least my role, they had been tracking. This is still the period where they were taking 4 years. There's a lot of money in the record business then. It was their comeback album, so they were recording even, I think, end of 96 or 97, and then actually my role at this time, Donald said, do you want to arrange the horns? Or he said, we're going to start the sessions. And he said, do you want to arrange? Or I said, yeah, let me know if you want me to arrange the stuff. And I'll never forget, he said to me, you seem like you're good at taking rejection. I said, yeah, I am. He said, good, that'll be helpful to us. And so I sat in the studio with them, and sure enough, they loved, 60% of the ideas, and 40% they would go, nope. And I didn't take it personally, just moved on, said, let's find some stuff that works. Mm-hmm. And I wound up playing, I always loved Victor Feldman and his role on those albums, and Don Grolnick and Joe Sample and all the keyboard playing. And again, I didn't have the kind of chops on piano that I could play a lot of stuff, but I could play very good arranger's piano. And I wound up actually playing Wurlitzer on the title track or something. I was playing, and they just said to the engineer, hey, can you record this? And they said, do a couple more passes. And as I'm playing it, I realized, they want to use this. So that was Two Against Nature.
Were you in college during this period also?
After high school, I did the Philip Morris Superband tour, which was about 2 months or something, but it didn't allow me to go to school. Then I got into Manhattan School of Music for jazz composition. I wanted to do classical composition. but I got a free scholarship for jazz. As a side note, it was very strange. I got free scholarships to Manhattan School of Music, University of Miami, and I went up to Eastman. Did I ever tell you this story?
Mm-hmm.
And I went up to Eastman with a piece that I wrote for strings and trumpet. It was a ballet piece that I wrote my senior year in high school, kind of Copland-y. Honestly, it was like Copland with a touch of Ravel and Stravinsky and a lot of John Williams, because I loved E.T. And I also loved this girl who was a dancer. And so I wanted to be near her, so I wrote a piece that she would have to dance in. So I brought that piece to Eastman and really wanted to be a classical composition student at Eastman. And the head of composition up there brought me in, and he said, I heard your piece. It's very interesting. Very interesting indeed. I wonder why it's in 4/4. I said, well, but what do you mean? He goes, that's boring, isn't it? I said, well, yeah, but I come from jazz and pop music. He goes, I see. And he sat down at the piano. He said, I'd like to do an ear test. So he did, bing. He gave me a note, because I don't want a perfect pitch. He gave me a note. I said, okay, that's your reference point. He went, bing, boom, bing, ba. And in between each note, he would say, what is it? And I would say what note it is, wrote something down, like a doctor's morning, and he walked back to his table and said, so it's not your ears. And I'm starting to sweat. So we kept on going, and I said, this is really not going well, is it? And his final words were, Mr. Leonhart, what we're doing here in the composition department is Shakespeare. What you're doing is Mickey Mouse.
Man, it was like you were being evaluated based on some criteria that you weren't aware of.
Yeah, and I was highly uneducated in the world of classical composition and form and structure. But, dude, that's what I was going there to learn. And he crushed me like a bug. So, needless to say, I did not get into Eastman. And as a side note, there were some musicians who were furious later, some guys on the studio scene, like legendary players who said, you want me to call and say something? I said, no, I didn't get in. It probably, it really hurt, and it probably wasn't the right fit. So it was so surreal that I got free scholarships to 2 places and an out-and-out rejection, and I was called Mickey Mouse by the third. So I went to Manhattan School of Music. I believe that guy has since died.
Okay. And his name was? No.
I'll tell you after and he was a good composer too. That's the funny thing. He was just he was a prodigy who was highly intellectual and not the nicest guy. So I went to Manhattan School of Music and studied with Manny Album. But what I wanted to study was not jazz arranging. I wanted to study Bartók and Ravel and Bach and Messiaen and all these, things that were really outside of my comfort zone. And Manny Album, who was lovely, he did his best to provide that. But I don't think the structure at the school let him do that. He had me write a string quartet, which I think a string quartet did play it. And shit, I think it's at my studio. But I did write one. And it was a lot of fun. It was very challenging. So then I wasn't really happy at Manhattan School of Music. I applied to Columbia University and got in. And I loved it, but it was extremely difficult. And I was 19, and I was playing trumpet, and I don't think I really had the capacity to structure how I could be in school and be a musician. And I had a sensation, I loved it, but I had the sensation of drowning a little bit. It was overwhelming. So once I started getting busier on the music scene, and the Steely Dan tour came up and other things, I said to my parents, you know what? I'm not happy. I love school, but I'm getting behind. I feel like I'm doing 2 things badly instead of 1 thing very well. Mm-hmm. And they said, what would you like to do? And it was a wonderful moment. They said, what would you like to do? I said, I'd like to leave school and pursue the music thing with the option of going back. I was in my 3rd year. And they said, we support you. And that was really wonderful because I really felt heard, So I left.
You felt hurt in what way?
I felt hurt by my parents. I felt I was at a crossroads, and it was not, as I just said to you, I was doing 2 things poorly instead of 1 thing well. And now, sitting here now, I would love to go back to Columbia. I've kind of set up my life that it's like a college class, that I wind up, when I'm in a car driving with people, if someone, I like to find out what people have to share in their experience. I'm much more interested in other people these days than I used to be, partly because of being a parent. I would love to go to back to school. If I was financially able to take off 6 months, it'd be fascinating. But I left and then have been touring and recording since. So,
yeah, you strike me as somebody who is so open and constantly searching and constantly looking. Like you started this conversation by mentioning that you've been getting into surrealist painting.
Yeah,
which is, I think, probably one of many things you've gotten into since the last time I saw you.
The surrealist kick came. That a friend of mine, I had a day off from the Steely Dan tour this summer in Houston, and someone said, there's the Manil Museum. I said, never heard of that. I said, you have to see, there's a Rothko Chapel. And it was a friend who's not pretentious who said, you might really like it. And I was tired, and I was just going to, walk around or do something. And I said, no, you know what, this could be really cool. And I went, and he said that they specialized, it was a smallish museum about 2 miles from the hotel, and they had a big surrealist room. And I went in there, and immediately I felt like full of life and inspiration. And the Rothko Chapel is amazing because whether you're religious or slightly spiritual or whatever, it was designed by Rothko in 70 or 71, and he never lived to see it completed. But it is an incredibly calming, quiet place. And it just made me slow down and take everything in. And that's, in this day and age, that's a hard thing to do. The room in the Manil that was fascinating was the room of surrealists' collections, meaning Magritte, I don't think it was Dali, but others, maybe Calder as well. They had a room with their personal artifacts that they collected and they got inspired by. So a lot of African art, a lot of African masks, it would have been what today people would buy on eBay or at a yard sale. And I went, oh my God, so this is what they got, lit their brains. And it looked like a junkyard. It was well done, but it was the craziest shit in the world. Masks with spikes. And it reminded me of what my studio looks like that I try and clean up. And then my son said, you really have to clean this place up. And it was fascinating to see how 100 years ago people got inspiration. Especially the surrealist mind, they were clearly shared a similarity with all things exotic and going to parts of Africa and Asia, and I saw it, and it just lit a fire that reminded me of when you find an incredible book in college, that you wouldn't. It's something off the beaten path. So clearly, my mind is taking it all in the same way that it was in college. So.
You also said earlier when you were talking about it that there was something about the chaos within structure that spoke to you.
Yeah, that's very profound for me because from where I sit, the duality of incredible technique that's needed. Take Salvador Dali or something. There's incredible technique and structure and form, and it's clear that many years have been spent learning how to draw a straight line, but then there's the rejection of reality or logic, whether drug-induced or not. It's these two things living side by side. So it's incredible technique and then an amazing, almost chaotic freedom. And that, to me, is a beautiful balance. Knowing how to have... I was talking with someone about this the other night on a car ride, that when I've heard musicians or artists say, well, I don't want to learn to read music because I don't want it to ruin it. In theory, I get that, but to me, that's kind of the crap. Because why would you shut off that path? If you really think that learning to read music is going to shut you down, then you probably were pretty shut down to begin with. You might experience 5 or 6 months where you intellectualize things a little bit, but in the end, it might open up some doors. And I've heard other people say that. They say, "Man, Jimi Hendrix didn't know how to read music." He didn't, but I've heard he wanted to. Mm-hmm. There's a way. You can't be afraid of structure or technique. It's what you do with it. as long as you keep that balance of, I think what the surrealists call that childlike freedom, or an abandonment of all reason and all logic. So it's really fascinating to me to apply that to things.
I can understand why it would be, and in fact, I hear it. Although it sounds like something that you are thinking about recently, I hear it. I mean, I was just listening to the Seahorse and the Storyteller before you came over. I thought I should get myself in some kind of headspace before we talked, and that's the most recent record that I have of yours. And there is a crossroads between the primitive and the elevated to a certain degree. I mean, it's very thought out and it's very arranged, and yet even sonically there's something very primitive about it. So I think you've sort of been doing that in a way. Yeah,
and I didn't know it. Sometimes I feel with that, especially when lyrics are involved, that because, and I was talking to my wife about this, that because I grew up so focused on timbre, melody, that my brain learned to listen to things, focus first on just that, on the instrument. That I wasn't focused on lyrics. And my son, who at 4 hears things the top down, hears as most of the world does, lyrics first. That I can be hard on myself in terms of my own lyric writing. That I know when I've really exhausted a lyric and I feel it's complete, and when I feel like I didn't spend enough time on a lyric. And I don't have a specific example on that album, but that was such an ambitious album in my mind, and there was so much going on with sort of getting this destroyed sounding thing that's like beat up and mangled and just kind of, which I love, along with, as you said, it's very carefully arranged, and the vocals are also extremely layered, with the majority of the things having a ghost voice, like, a fifth or an octave above. It was very ambitious. Sometimes I listen and wonder if I achieved what I wanted to with that. And then in the next breath I say, who cares? It was done, and I'm forced to hear it a lot at home because my son listens to that one too, and I do still enjoy that a lot. But it's what you're saying is true. I haven't thought about it. It's the combination of light and darkness, form, structure and chaos, which I never really understood that was so tempting to me. But it's very seductive.
I imagine that working with Steely Dan and with Donald Fagen is a different process.
Absolutely.
I mean, I first became aware of you through Two Against Nature. So I was so intrigued early on, because we're pretty close in age, just to know who is this kid, really, who's working with an iconic musical group from another generation. I know you mentioned it a little bit, but what has that relationship been like over the last 15 years?
Well, there are multiple relationships. There's the one with Steely Dan as an entity, that's Donald and Walter. There's my relationship with Donald Fagen, and there's my relationship with Walter Becker. So, and they're each, because these are very strong personalities, each one is unique. My relationship with Donald is the deepest because we've spent the most time together. There is a very symbiotic relationship. We feel very comfortable around each other, and I believe that there's a mutual respect, even though there's a difference in age. And he's an icon. I don't see him as an icon anymore. I mean, I respect him, but that happens. You spend enough time around someone; it's a healthy relationship. I see him as a good friend who is very talented, and I have a lot of respect for. But that's probably very healthy to our relationship. So It's been fascinating the way it's developed. I mean, what I sometimes think of, hopefully not on stage when I'm supposed to be doing my job, but I am 9 years. When I met him, he was 48, and he's now 65. So when we met, I was 22, but I'm closer in age to when 17 years ago.
And he probably seemed like such an adult.
He did?
I don't know. Did he at the time?
That's a tough question, because he's a very unique artist, and he'd be the first one to say that is he an adult? He's got a very childlike quality to him. He reminds me of a writer in many ways. Like, I see Jack Kerouac or something, or Dylan or something. He's very comfortable being isolated. So I don't know if he was an adult. in some ways, he was more of a rock star when we met, and therefore more of a child, and he's grown up into a responsible adult who has to face the reality of a changing record business, the reality of having a step-grandchild, two step-grandchildren, what do you do when someone, I'm not sure if he's changing diapers, but when you have a stinky diaper in the room, that's pretty humbling. So in some ways, he's both younger and more grown up now. Mm-hmm. I think he's more developed, and we had recording the Sunken Condos was a really amazing experience with him, and it wasn't always easy. And we spent a lot of time just like this in a room. The mics were set up, everything was just coming in day after day, and it was a lot of days. And I'm sure sometimes I pressed a button in him that he was pissed off, and I know that there were times when I was bugged with him and frustrated, and we kept on going. And you invest a lot in a relationship, and in the end, there's a closeness, there's a trust, and that's nice because he's a big brain. He's got a lot of great ideas up there.
You produced the last Donald Fagen record.
Yes, it says produced by Michael Leonhart and Donald Fagen. I would, no matter what it says, in my mind and bones, it feels the same way as when I produce something solely, and that's not a shot at him. He did an invaluable amount of work and it's his concepts, but to be truthful, it had the same. I felt like I was carrying the same weight as when someone says, "Will you produce the album?" And that's because I really cared about every nook and cranny. He had the final say, but there wasn't one thing that didn't go through my filter. Mm-hmm. And I enjoy that responsibility, but it's also an enormous responsibility. Particularly
considering the reputation that his records and the Steely Dan records have, and the Nightfly is such a classic, and so many people consider it to be, I think, one of the best examples of great production. Desert Island, exactly. So to be taking on that responsibility, and even to feel it as a responsibility, I can imagine. If I were ever in a position like that, I would have to kind of remind myself to let all that go.
Yeah, I mean, I think I also have a streak that's highly arrogant and narcissistic, so I can luckily tap into it and go, "Oh, sure, I'm going to do something great." And then there's the flip side that goes, "Oh, I don't know," but I would just crumble under the pressure if I spent too much time thinking on it. And I've learned to get lost in the work every day. So 6 to 8 hours of work, and then you're too tired to worry. Mm-hmm. You just go, which is a pleasant distraction. But yes, there were times when I thought, you just have to let it go. And Donald especially has learned that he has no interest in referencing or recreating. I was surprised that he was open to using similar instruments, Prophet 5, Mini Moog, Clavinet Rhodes, some things, maybe ARP 2600, things that I thought he had long since thrown out. But with a proper discussion and directness, I said, "Hey, can we use this?" He said, "Yeah, oh yeah, I remember using those." And he hadn't used them in 30 years.
Yeah.
And that, to me, that was a key part of the equation, to get those things in there, to even say, "Let's have a saxophone solo." And I said, yeah, but maybe, how would you feel about getting a harmonica? And he's not a dummy. He knew that he had done it on Hey 19 or the Prophet 5 and IGY. But instead of going, he didn't say, "Oh, that'd be cool, it's like the Nightfly," but he didn't say no. He just said, "If you think it'll work, yeah." So it was interesting to see that he's not concerned with the past, but he's not afraid of it either.
This thing about a little bit of arrogance is, I think, really informative. I remember you and I had a conversation years ago when I was going through something, negotiating with a record label, and you said to me, you kind of have to be arrogant in these situations. You have to kind of go in with a little extra confidence, even if there's a part of you that doesn't have that confidence. When you walk in the room, you kind of have to have it. And it seems like at some point you picked that up you've given today 10 anecdotes that gave you an opportunity to learn that lesson.
Yes. Well, the one, this is not arrogance, but there was one flip side to the Philip Morris thing, which is an anecdote and then learning and applying it later. So I felt invisible. on the Philip Morris tour, there were some people that were very helpful. We would go on at 8 o'clock, and then at 9:30 we'd play a 45-minute set. Then it was Nina Freelon. She played a 35-minute set, and then the masters would come on. Kenny Barron, Bob Crenshaw, Kenny Washington, Donald Byrd, Phil Woods, Slide Hampton, and Jimmy Heath. That's a lot of experience there. Now, those guys were all lovely with me. I didn't spend a lot of time because I was on the schedule of the younger group, but they were all super cool, and I'd never forgot it. And I was having a hard time because in my group, I was invisible. So years later, probably 15 years later, I was on the road with Lenny Kravitz, playing trumpet with him for 10 months. And there was a young guy who was, I think he was doing sound or something. And I could have easily just ignored him or stepped all over him or whatever. And I could see that he was new and he was looking for a friend. And I wasn't looking to have a best friend. At this point, I was seasoned enough on the road and knew that I had my hands full being on the tour. And he came up to me one day and said, "What do you think?" I said, "You know what? It's a strange place on the road. Just don't take anything personally. And if you need some help, within reason, let me know." And his eyes lit up and his shoulders relaxed. And he called me 2 nights later. So, "You want to go out to dinner?" I said, "No, I can't. But maybe coffee." I was like, I didn't want to be best friends, but I was definitely there. And I could have if I was an angry guy, I could have stepped all over him and made him feel like shit. And in my heart, I knew that there was no reason to do that, and there was no reason for him to experience what I experienced. So I helped him out a little bit, and he had a great tour. You can't prevent, as we do with our children, you can't prevent them from falling and scraping themselves because it's an important part. But you can,
make the landing a little softer.
Yeah, or teach them how to get up.
Yeah, right. That's probably more significant.
Yeah.
I have 2 final questions for you. One, where are you going now?
I am going to pick up a cavaquinho from our friend Mauro for an album that I'm about to start producing. Not today, but I'm starting in 2 weeks. And I looked around, and a cavaquinho is much like a harmonium or a pump organ. You cannot buy one online. You will screw yourself.
Oh, did you try to buy one?
No, because I know. Certain things, it's just a no-go for buying online. You have to, because there are ones that are really poorly made and advertised. So it's just a waste of time. So there are certain things that require you got to play it. Yeah. And then back to the city for a couple of meetings. And I'm going to see Ben Monder and Theo Bleckman tonight at the Jazz Standard with Jamie.
Oh, nice. Date night.
A little bit.
Would you
Yes.
consider sitting at the Rhodes and playing me a B-flat 13 sharp 11 with a C triad on top?
Yeah. The way that it was described was... And then there was So I think this one, that's probably what I heard on the Steely Dan or Carlton, but now the Steely Dan thing would probably be, and the Stravinsky one would be, and the Mancini. Yeah, what's the Mancini thing? I got the vibes here. Wait, so what do I play on vibes? What should I play on vibes? Just play. You could play C triad.